I'm going to show you a new product, which is 2015. If you can see that, vintage Riché.
Yep.
Now, one of the things that we've been talking about, I mean, the mainstays of the portfolio are the vintage Brut. As I said, that's what we've been making since basically the beginning of the history of the property. Blanc de Blanc, as we've started to isolate the premium Chardonnay blocks on the property. And Cuvée Exceptional Vintage Rosé, but we were looking at diversity in the portfolio in the same way that champagne producers do. So most Tasmanian sparkling and Australian sparkling for that matter is squarely in Brut classification or drier. When we started to discuss this with the winemaking team, we sort of looking at it and going, okay, well, we've got such great acidity. I'm sure that we can produce wines that have a higher dosage, higher sugar dosage. So this is the first release that we've done. So our vintage Brut normally sits around 9.5 to 11 grams per litre of sugar dosage. This Riché is 19 grams.
So it's out of extra dry. It's in the dry, the sec range.
In the sec, yes.
Yeah.
So, but it's not about sweetness. It's about richness. So it's when you start to talk about sugar, people sort of automatically start to slide straight into things being sweet. But this is just changing the flavor profile. It brings more orange mandarin citrus notes rather than the lemon and lime citrus notes. It sits lower on the palate and richer and more angular on the palate, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's really interesting because I haven't tried this one yet and I was expecting it to be sweet. But on the palate, it's actually not sweet. I'm not getting sweetness at all.
No.
On the finish, I am a little bit. There's almost like a toffee note, maybe something on the finish there. But definitely the citrus notes that you mentioned, there is that richness as well. Yes, very flat on the palate. But yeah, it's a totally different experience to what I was expecting in a good way.
Yes. Well, when we were first doing it, I mean, the dosage trial was kind of secret, and the winemaker didn't actually tell us how high he'd taken it. I was hoping that we were going to go up into mid-20s, which I still think that can carry. But we showed it at as a clean skin at a wine club dinner, just to get some, I guess, a little bit of market research. Didn't say anything about it. And it wasn't until after they tasted it and we got the feedback that I mentioned how high the sugar was. And the consensus around the room, apart from, like you said, almost a slightly honey note. And it's interesting, I haven't seen this before, but I get the smell of a Jaffa on the nose.
Yeah, there is.
Not chocolatey, but it's that smell of the actual outside coating of a Jaffa.
Yeah, but there's a little bit of chocolate with the orange is what you get, isn't it? That. Yeah,
so
I'm also getting a bit of hazelnut maybe as well.
Yep. So that's obviously time on lees again coming through, showing those sort of those autolytic characters coming through. Again, it was on lees for just over 3 years. But it's a really interesting.
It's really interesting, actually. Every sip is a different experience so far. That's interesting. And I also think that it does make it an interesting food match as well. Because it has the higher dosage in it, you could have it with a sweeter dish without the sweetness overpowering either.
Yes.
But yes, because it's still giving you savoury notes, it still would work, to pair with your entree and main courses as well.
Absolutely. And I think Japanese ingredients, Japanese food is a perfect match with sparkling wine. So when you're thinking about things like miso and mirin, which have got sort of higher sweetness, but with that really savory umami characteristic there as well, I think they work extremely well. We've got a dish that we've got on at the moment, which is miso fermented daikon with some sesame turnip and and some flying fish roe, actually, and that actually works extremely well.
Wow. Yeah. So that's at the cellar drawer, is it?
Yes. Yes. So we do a menu, a tapas style menu, which is designed as a complement to the sparkling wines. Obviously all about sparkling. So, but the Japanese ingredients have slightly higher sweetness levels than most people think. And obviously with that savory umami characteristic coming through, works extremely well with sparkling. And they're restrained and elegant in the same way.
Yeah, I think people don't realise that a lot of Asian dishes, Thai dishes are similar. There's a lot of palm sugar in Thai dishes. They actually have sweeteners often with it to balance out the spiciness.
Absolutely. And they're sort of balancing out in Japanese food. I guess they're balancing out the savory umami characteristics or helping lift it. In things like Thai food, you're balancing out the sourness of and sort of the sort of high citrusy characteristics of lime and things like that they add in. So yeah, it's all about balance. And that's really what the Riché is about. It's about balance. Yeah. So unless you were highly susceptible to sugar or sweetness in wines that you taste in general, there's no way that you'd pick that as being as high as 19 grams.
No, I wouldn't pick it as that. Yeah, I mean, usually when you have something that's a sec, I'm like, oh, that's quite sweet. If you don't know beforehand, you go immediately, oh, that's quite sweet. Yeah. And for those who've done our whole course, we started back in tasting techniques where we talked about levels of sweetness. And yeah, I think the sweetness ratings are confusing because extra dry and dry actually is the sweeter end of the scale, and the brut is the dry end of the scale. So if people haven't done all of that and they're wondering why we're saying dry is sweet, that's why. And before I knew all of that, I'd look at a bottle, I'd taste it, I'm like, oh, that's very sweet, but it says dry. Why is that so sweet? And yeah, that is why, because of the sweetness rating. But yeah, if I didn't know that beforehand, I wouldn't pick that. Yeah, I wouldn't think it's an extra brut, but yeah, I would still think it was in the brut to extra dry range.
Absolutely, and I think it's Clover Hill tends to use higher sugar dosage than most of the producers in the region anyway. As I said, we're the lowest dosages that we do are 7.5 to 8 grams per litre of sugar for the non-vintages, and the bruts are always tending to be on the higher end or closer to that top end of brut classification, whereas it's more common to have wines more down to sort of 5 or 6 grams and lower. Guys like Connor van der Eest at Marilla, he's definitely down sort of sub 5 grams per litre and lower. So
yeah, there's definitely a trend for Brut Nature and the extra brut, not just in sparkling wines, but in champagne as well, that I see. Also, when I talked about the sweetness levels in the tasting techniques, I also gave an example of what that really means in terms of if people are worried about sugar, it's actually not that much sugar that you have. When we say 19 grams, that's actually in the bottle. It's not that you're having 19 grams of sugar in your glass. And,
exactly.
Yeah, I think, actually the 19 grams might be similar to a juice. I'd have to look. I did look at the maths on it anyway and said, like, for example, a glass of orange juice has got about 5 times the amount of sugar as your champagne glass has in a normal brut range. So for those who are worried about sugar intake, and it's not medical advice, yes, if you do have diabetes or something, please check with your doctor first. But yeah, I don't think we should get too obsessed with sugar intake. It's more about balancing out the wine, and the dosage is one of those techniques that the winemaker has to be able to balance out that acidity that we want in the wine as well. So.
Absolutely, and I think the range of dosage liqueurs that you can use, or the winemakers have at their disposal, as well as just sugar dosage, are quite extraordinary. So. Using things like cognac to create really sort of heavier, much richer, yeastier styles. as a general rule, we're using very minimal. We maybe use a little bit of Chardonnay that's aged in oak, potentially, but usually things like Blanc de Blanc have just water and sugar, no other no other additions.
And you also mentioned that you don't do mallow. Is that correct in the beginning?
Not necessarily intentionally, no. So we're looking. I mean, we think that the fruit that we produce is bright and vibrant, and creates really elegant, restrained aperitif style sparkling wine, which is what we're known for. So malolactic conversion, it may happen in some wines, but as a general rule, when you're doing that, you're going to change the acid structure completely and make them richer and more lactic, which is not necessarily what we're chasing from a house style. We'd prefer to get those pastry or lactic notes from lees contact as opposed to from pre-tirage winemaking.
So that's interesting. That is lovely. Quite an experience in the glass. So it's not what you may expect, but it's definitely an experience. And I think playing around with different food matches with that would be lots of fun. Every sip has been different so far that I've had as well. So that was good. And I should say, do I have this correct, that that's only available direct through the cellar door? That's not, you won't find that in wine stores?
No, it's a direct to consumer product, so it'll be through our wine club or direct to the cellar door only. I think you can buy it off the website, but yeah, and it's the first one. So watch this space. There are other new products coming out over the next few years. Hopefully, in the new year, 1 or 2 new products as well, maybe in the middle of the year. So again, it's about diversity and creating interest within the portfolio, but staying squarely in traditional method sparkling zone. So there's lots of things that we can play with.
Yeah, I think that's lots of fun is how I'd describe that. You know, as I said, you could play around with different food matches. That's something you could have fun with a few friends and do little taste plates with. Yeah, I think that's...
Absolutely.
Yeah, good.